Good afternoon. It's Monday, February 1st. I'm Laura Cornfield, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. The Army today imposed a partial blockade on Ramallah following intelligence information of planned terror attacks emanating from the area. Only humanitarian cases will be given permission to travel in and out of the West Bank city, as well as residents. Earlier this morning, soldiers thwarted an attempted infiltration in the western Samaria community of Salit. Troops operating in the area spotted a breach in the security fence and a terrorist armed with a knife hiding in the bushes. They tried to arrest him at first, but then shot and killed him after he attacked them with the knife. The terrorist was identified as 19-year-old Ahmed Abed El Latif Tuba from the village of Jumain, near Tulkaram. Also today, police arrested a 14-year-old Arab boy in the Old City after he was discovered carrying a knife. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has called Israeli settlement activity an affront to the Palestinian people, adding it is human nature to resist occupation. In an opinion piece titled "Don't Shoot the Messenger," published by the New York Times yesterday, the Secretary General also criticized Israel's response to remarks he made last week concerning Israel's policy and the stalemate in peace talks with the Palestinians. Criticism of the UN or attacks against its Secretary General comes with the territory, he wrote, saying it cannot be sustainable to keep lashing out at every well-intended critic. He went on to say that while he will also stand up for Israel's right to exist, the time has come for Israel, the Palestinians, and the international community to read the writing on the wall. Keeping people under indefinite occupation undermines the security and future of both Israelis and Palestinians. The security establishment is thoroughly examining reports that Hamas is building more terror tunnels along the southern border with Gaza. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed that Israel will respond with more force than ever against Hamas if attacked from the underground passages. IBA's Margot Dudkevich reports.
Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon insisted today that no underground tunnels from the Gaza Strip have been located inside Israel. This despite concerns expressed by residents living in close proximity to the Gaza Strip who claim they hear construction noises. Ya'alon said that every complaint received is thoroughly checked by the security establishment before it is ruled out. He warned, however, any tunnel discovered will be immediately destroyed. His comments echoed those of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, who, when speaking before Israeli ambassadors and consul generals at the annual meeting, vowed Israel's response will be harsher than force used during Operation Protective Edge. I think they understand this in the region and in the world. I hope we do not need to do this, but our defensive and offensive capabilities are developing rapidly, and I do not suggest anyone test us. The Prime Minister's words came hours after members of the Knesset State Controller Committee visited Gaza border communities to hear residents' complaints concerning the renewal of tunnel construction by Hamas and examine what the defense establishment is doing to address their fears. Last week, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh announced that Hamas will continue to build its network of underground passages and warned armed factions in Gaza are preparing for the next round of fighting with Israel. Margot Dudkevich, IBA News.
In what's being hailed as a historic decision, the cabinet approved a move that would allow women and non-Orthodox Jewish groups to worship at the Western Wall. Under the compromise, a section of the Western Wall, a bit south of the Wailing Wall Plaza, is being expanded for Jewish prayer by Reform and conservative worshippers, as well as women of the Wall. While the ultra-Orthodox community remains opposed to the idea, it was warmly welcomed by many Reform and conservative movements.
For me, this is an extremely joyful day, but as with many joyful things, there is this cloud above it. And for me, the cloud is that there was a discussion, a government discussion, as to whether or not Jews can pray according to their way. That shouldn't be a discussion in any country, never mind a democracy, never mind the Jewish state, that there's a conversation about whether or not Jews can pray at their holy place.
Joining me in the studio to discuss this decision is Regev Ben David, an expert on Judaism and state of the Ein Parat, the Midrashah. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Laura.
Indeed a historic decision in your view, or not?
Yes, definitely, Laura. Yesterday's resolution by the Israeli government is a new stage in the relationship of Judaism and state in Israel. It is a firm declaration that the Western Wall, and by way of expansion, the Temple Mount, Jerusalem, no longer belong to one specific group or worldview in the Jewish people, but to the entire Jewish people, to Klal Am Yisrael.
What kind of messages is giving out internationally and here at home?
So first of all, I think it's a message to the Jewish people. There is no one way to worship God. There is no one way to be a Jew. You can experience your Jewish identity whether through Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Orthodox, or secular identity. And whichever your approach is, it is legitimized by the State of Israel.
The women of the Wall have been waging this battle for over 2 decades. Who are the main winners or losers of the move?
So it's a political compromise, so naturally there are concessions on each side. The ultra-Orthodox establishment here forfeits its monopoly over the prayer at the Temple Mount. The female Orthodox feminists are another very important group whose interests are not necessarily addressed by this agreement, since they do seek a halachic worship, but one that also respects their place as women. So currently, they are neither catered for in the northern, the existing prayer area, nor necessarily will they be catered for and addressed in the new southern part, since this will be a co-ed part.
So it's a practical rather than an ideological solution.
Well, I think it's not as easy to distinguish between the two. I do think that the Orthodox feminists are a very important group in the field of Israeli Jewish pluralism, and it's important to make sure that they get addressed.
But turning to the Orthodox male community, the Orthodox Jewish community, you can certainly understand and perhaps even relate to their concerns about this decision?
Well, definitely. From their view, co-ed prayer, men and women together, is not the correct way of worshiping God. They consider that as Chilul Hashem, as a desecration of the name of God. What I consider as a perfectly legitimate way of worshiping God, or a way of expressing one's Jewish identity. But so far, from 1967 till now, 1967 when
in the past they did pray together, though.
That's exactly the point. So starting from 1967, when the State of Israel regained sovereignty over the Kotel, the authority was given by the State of Israel to the Ministry of Religious Affairs and the Chief Rabbinate, and they issued a Orthodox Haredi practice there. This wasn't always the case. We should remind ourselves that the Kotel exists for 2,000 years, and we see pictures from 100 years ago where men and women pray together. So we have to take it with a grain of salt when the Orthodox establishment says that the customs of the place, minhag hamakom, is Haredi practice. That was not always the case, and now, after this resolution of the State of Israel, it is once again open for a variety of practices.
Any idea of when the new plaza will be built?
So it should take place within the upcoming month and years. Maybe a note to conclude on that. It's been 49 years since 1967. And after 49 years in Jewish tradition and Jewish law comes the Jubilee, Shnat HaYovel. And in that year, the ownership of lands and territories is reset, and whichever monopoly or excessive acquisition of one group over the others is being reset and rebooted. I think it's a very symbolic timing for the State of Israel to make this decision, and maybe in the upcoming June, which will signify 49 years, we will live to see a redistribution, and once again the Kotel will go back to be the property of the entire Jewish people.
Regev Ben David, an expert on Judaism and stayed at the Ein Prat, the Midrashah. Thank you so much for being with us and explaining your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Disturbing findings have been released regarding the possible effect of refineries and pollution levels in the northern Haifa district on the local population's health. A study published by Haifa University revealed that babies born in the area had a lower than average weight and head circumference. Research focused on Kiryat Chaim, Kiryat Bialik, southeast Kiryat Tivon, and the Carmel area. The study found that rates of lung cancer and lymphoma in these areas is up to 5 times the national average. The findings were presented to the steering committee commissioned by the Haifa Municipality Association and funded by refineries and the electric company as part of their request to extend their operations. The study is based on data compiled from 2012 to the present day. Some 200 million shekels have already been spent rehabilitating the Kishon River in Haifa and setting up a park along its banks. But now it turns out the designated recreational area is no more than a storage facility. IBA's Ari O'Sullivan has that story.
If someone living in Haifa had a dream of seeing the banks of the Kishon River turned into a park and promenade, then reality is about to crush it. A plan to transform the banks into a large park spreading out over 1,200 dunams has now been shrunk to less than half of this, in order to make way for the Haifa port to store shipping containers. And even this is being cut down so that all that remains from the original park plans will be just a narrow bike path. Already signs of the earthworks are evident along the banks, but don't be mistaken, this isn't for the park but for construction of the new Haifa port. Residents were hoping they would be able to preserve this sliver of the ecosystem of the Kishon River that had been rehabilitated and had started to draw back the wildlife, like migrating birds and fish. But soon their habitat will be swallowed up by the port's progress. The News Report Company responded that the land was always theirs and designated for trade, so they weren't taking anything from anybody. The Environmental Protection Ministry said that the agreements haven't yet been finalized and they were still trying to enlarge the park. Ari O'Sullivan for IBA News.
Israel has a new Attorney General. Avichai Mendelblit today assumed the position from Yehuda Weinstein, who stepped down after 6 years on the job. The official transition of office was marked this afternoon at the Central Bar Association's office in Jerusalem. Mendelblit served as the cabinet secretary and is considered close to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He was considered a controversial nomination due to what opponents called a conflict of interest. The High Court rejected petitions over his selection. Today marks the 13th anniversary of the death of Israel's first astronaut, Ilan Ramon, who perished along with 6 other crew members on board the Columbia space shuttle that disintegrated during its re-entry, 16 minutes before scheduled landing. During the 16-day flight, the crew conducted some 80 successful experiments. Ramon is the only foreign recipient of the U.S. Congressional Space Medal of Honor, which he was awarded posthumously. The annual International Space Conference in memory of Ilan Ramon will kick off tomorrow in Herzliya, bringing together some of the world's leading space agency delegations, experts, and researchers. A new report from the OECD shows that while Israel's economy is strong, poverty and inequality persist and the cost of living is very high. According to the annual survey released by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which reviews the socio-economic status of well-developed nations, Israel showed remarkable resilience with a 13th consecutive year of economic growth. However, at the same time, the local financial surrounding has failed to deliver the fruits of growth to much of its population. The country's poverty rate was the second highest among OECD countries, following Mexico. The report warned that low rates of employment in the ultra-Orthodox and Israeli Arab communities were severely hurting the economy's performance. Responding to the report, Finance Minister Moshe Kahlon said that the government was working feverishly to correct almost all of the problems mentioned. In local money matters, shares were down on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, while the shekel was mixed in foreign currency trading. Here are the late afternoon figures. Turning to the forecast, and temperatures will drop slightly tomorrow with chances of isolated rain showers. Here are the highs and lows for the next 24 hours at home and abroad. And that brings us to the end of this broadcast of IBA News. We leave you now with a clip dedicated to Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon to the popular Hebrew song, Will You Hear My Voice Wherever You Are. I'll be back here tomorrow, same time, same channel. Until then, have a good evening, and shalom from Jerusalem.
The music was for Elan. That was Hatishma Koli by Hakalonet Gavohim.
Yes, sir. It's great to be awake for a Hebrew, very old song by a very good singer. And it's great to be here in space and hear Hebrew. A very glad, a very special glad for the Kiddush, for the Shabbat.